Welcome back to Steve Wraith's True Crime podcast. We're talking to Sonia Poulton today. Hiya, Sonia.
Thank you, Steve. Hello there.
Yeah, good to have you back on. So, obviously, we're just touching on the Madeleine McCann case, and there's a new suspect being announced. I found that rather bizarre. I'll be honest, we were stuck in the middle of a pandemic. We've got COVID, of course, which we'll come to very shortly to talk about your new documentary. But suddenly, all over the news again, we had that picture of poor Madeleine McCann and a new suspect, and there seemed to be a lot of work going on. What was your take on all of that?
My feeling on all of that was it was a bit of a distraction. They basically had a crime and they wanted it to fit Christian Bruckner. Christian Bruckner is a German man who's currently serving time in a German jail for a number of reasons, it would appear, for drugs. And there was an outstanding issue where he had been accused of the rape of a pensioner in Portugal. He was basically a drifter. He was said to be in Portugal at the same time that Madeleine was reported missing. I mean, don't get me wrong, Steve. The more I look into that man's background, he's absolutely vile individual. He has paedophile activity in his past. It would appear that he's a rapist. He's a career criminal. He's made life absolutely miserable for many, many, many people. But I don't believe he is the man responsible for the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. But the German police, they made an announcement. So it was a few weeks ago now when I think about it, maybe about 2 months ago, I, as a journalist, heard there was a press conference by Scotland Yard because obviously we have Operation Grange, which is the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine. And that's been going since, I think they started the initial investigation to look at the Portuguese investigation in 2011. And I think it's been going since about 2012, 2013. We know it's probably about £13 million of taxpayers' money that has been spent on Operation Grange for a crime that didn't even happen in this country. And we also know, because I've made 2 documentaries, and a man called Colin Sutton has spoken in both my documentaries actually on Madeleine McCann. And Colin was a senior investigating officer at the Metropolitan Police. Colin became most famous. There was an ITV program about him because of his work to do with finally jailing Levi Belfield, who was responsible for the death of Millie Dowler as one person. But Colin has many, many other achievements under his belt of nailing absolutely vile, awful people. And Colin was rumoured to be the man who was going to be leading Operation Grange, and it was in the News of the World when the News of the World still existed. And Colin received a phone call from a senior cop at the Metropolitan Police, said, if they're going to ask you to do Operation Grange, don't do it. And Colin said, why? And he says all this in our doc on the record. And Colin said, why? And the cop said to him, because they won't let you investigate how you want to. And I said to Colin, well, how do you interpret that? And he said, I wouldn't be allowed to look at the parents. And that was absolutely the case from the get-go. The investigating officer of Operation Grange actually made an announcement that neither the parents or the people who were there were considered, people of interest. Well, that's absolutely outrageous, Steve, because anybody who knows anything about disappearance of children, they know that there is a high probability that the child has gone missing as a consequence of the people who were around the child. That's a statistic. That's a known fact. So if you're going to have an investigation and you immediately don't look at the people who were there around the child, what sort of investigation is it? So that's the foundation of Operation Grange, which is the British investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine. Of course, we had the ongoing Portuguese police investigation, which was completely rubbished in British media. A lot of xenophobia, a lot saying it was a terrible investigation. No, it wasn't actually. It was, one of Portugal's biggest manhunts. They invested in it greatly. Cops were returning from their holiday to search the ground and look for Madeleine when Madeleine's own mum wasn't even looking for Madeleine, right? So it's very easy to criticise the Portuguese police, but they were giving up actual time. I mean, there are people in that village, Praia de Luz, where Madeleine was reported missing. I've been to the scene of crime twice. That village in Portugal has been devastated by that event that took place 13 years ago. People lost their jobs. No, people didn't want to go there on holiday anymore. It was awful. The Ocean Club where it happened around, I think they got rid of 128 staff following the disappearance of Madeleine. So people were really, really devastated. It was a devastating crime that took place. A lot of problems with it. A lot of money's been spent. Christian Bruckner is the latest in a long line of suspects. And what's interesting, Steve, is Gonzalo Amaral, who was the original lead coordinator of the Portuguese police. He's the detective who has very much been pitted against Kate and Jerry McCann. They sued him for his book, The Truth of the Lie. They originally won, and he has since won. And you know, because as the Supreme Court judges said in Portugal, the truth is that the case was only archived in Portugal. It was never solved, and it was archived through lack of evidence. It's since been pulled out of being archived. But Kate and Jerry McCann have never been eliminated from the original police investigation. The Portuguese police believed very much that Madeleine died in apartment 5A, and an abduction was faked to a certain degree. Yeah. Well, not to a certain degree, was faked. Yeah, that's what the Portuguese police believed. German police seem to believe that Christian Bruckner is their man, but it's since emerged that German police are so desperate to nail this man. And also, don't forget, there'll be a certain amount of gravitas that comes with solving the case of the world's most famous missing child, right? I'm sure that's quite seductive for the German prosecutor, who seems to absolutely adore and love the camera and says a great deal into the camera. And one man who had worked with German police said that there was a problem in translation, and where the German police kept saying they had concrete evidence that Christian Bruckner had killed Madeleine, not only did they have none of the sort, but concrete evidence apparently to the German police actually means rumor. Well, you know, I mean, it's like there's a big press conference based on a rumor, right? And so they've since done all manner of things. Portuguese police, interestingly, recently, I don't know if you saw it in the news, they were digging up some wells in Portugal. Well, what was interesting about that was none of the news outlets talked about how those wells were actually an area, famously, where Jerry McCann's cell phone pinged. And that was after he had returned from America from going to see about the big organization, the Center for National Center for Missing Children, where there's a great deal of money being made, you know, for missing children. We must remember that this is a business. Missing children is a business for these charities. Anyway, Jerry had returned from that, and he'd gone off to this area, which Portuguese police were recently searching the wells. So I thought that was quite interesting. But the German police, they have been recently digging up an allotments in an area that Christian Bruckner was living out of his camper van for about a year, because he is a traveller. He's just one of those people that just keep moving on, right? Probably with no great foundations attached to him, you know. Goodness knows what went on in his childhood, but that's a whole other story for a whole other time, and I'm not that shrink. So, you know, but so German police, they were digging up this allotments, went away with carrier bags and everything, but I think it's just a distraction, because even if you want to believe that Christian Bruckner is the man, why would somebody be such an idiot that they would take, you know, because don't forget, it was within not even within 24 hours, within 12 hours, Madeleine was all over the headlines, right? She had already become world famous within days. So why would anybody want to take Madeleine, either alive or dead, 1,500 miles through, you know, passport checkouts, clearance, do you know what I mean? With such a famous person on board to then go and bury her in Hanover, Germany. These people think we're idiots. I mean, I don't claim to be a detective, but even to me, that doesn't sound right, you know? But nobody who knows the story believes what's going on with Christian Bruckner. There's been over 8,000 sightings of Madeleine McCann, right, since she was reported missing. So to me, they need to go back to the beginning. They need to start with the people who were there.
It's certainly a case that's going to run, and unfortunately, you know, as you say, it'll always be big news. And I want to move on to the coverage, really news coverage. I think people are starting to wake up, and I think that people like Sean Atwood, who's of course a good friend of yours, you know, you're doing like weekly shows with Sean now, which is great. And I think sometimes you get you know, people like Sean and yourself get tarred with the brush of conspiracy theorist by those people who want to attack you. But I think it's actually a new way of reporting the facts. And I think there's a lot more people actually waking up to this way of listening to things and watching things. So, why do you think that the mainstream media has gone in a particular direction? Is it government? Is it higher powers? Why do you think that we are facing this current style of media?
What, in terms of the McCann case or just in general?
Just in general, because we'll come on to Prince Andrew and Ghislaine
Yeah,
Maxwell next,
yeah,
and
yeah,
all of that. I mean, that's another case in point where
sure.
there's a certain directive, there's a certain narrative which surrounds a particular case. So, I mean, why do you think we're in this kind of world where the media warps the facts?
Yeah, well, it's multi-layered why that is. First of all, the relationship between journalists and people in power is an unhealthy one and has been for many decades. It is not unusual for journalists and people like politicians or whomever to be godparents of each other's children, to holiday together, and that shouldn't be happening. You will never, ever, ever see me mixing with anybody that I need to be reporting on, first and foremost, because that is a conflict of interest. So I don't become friendly with people who may have to be examined by me as a journalist. So that's one thing. But it is also, there are a number of other reasons, and that is these people are complicit. It actually, the government and media have worked together for a very, very long time to create a narrative, and then and depending what the agenda is. So for a very good example of how a narrative was created was in 2012, 2013. I do a lot of work into injustices, so that's my area. So in 2012, 2013, the coalition government, which was obviously made up of Tories and Lib Dems, they were pushing through the welfare reform bill. And the welfare reform bill was one of the most punishing pieces of legislation that I'd seen in a long time, and would deeply impact anybody who was reliant on benefits. That would include sick and disabled people, people with invisible illnesses, single parents. I mean, you name it. I mean, I can go on and on and on. That there's just not enough jobs, and that is the reality. Also, they like to say there is, but the truth is, there are not enough jobs that will keep you with a roof over your head. Some people have to do 3-4 jobs these days, which should never happen. That's a whole other story. So the welfare reform bill, I've got loads of. There's always asides with me because life is multi-layered like that. It's not. Do you know what I mean? Life isn't just one-dimensional. It's like this leads to that and that leads to that. And because it's really important to me to research well, it's a lot harder for people to call me a conspiracy theorist because I work from evidence, and they know that, and that's problematic for them. So I always try and push the envelope without going through it and making myself look like that they can catch me out, but every now and again they do, but that's something else. Anyway, where was I? Welfare reform bill. So they wanted to push through this really harsh legislation, which would be really terrible, very punishing. They would, take really important things, help and cars, all manner of things, money, carers, assistance that people needed. So I began fighting against this as a journalist and as an activist. And it then became clear to me how the government and the media were working together, because the media started to sprinkle their work with certain buzzwords: scroungers, feckless, irresponsible, when applied to single parents, to people on any form of benefits. And they were creating a narrative. And so what they were actually doing, and it worked very, very well, was things like Benefit Street, which I was on this morning as one example, arguing with the producer that he was deliberately demonizing people who were struggling for entertainment, which is exactly what they were doing, setting these people up. And seeing as I come from that sort of background, that shit is personal to me, right? So just because I'm in a very decent, good position now, it doesn't mean that I forget my roots. That will never, ever happen, right? So I still fight for my roots. And my roots was very much in a sort of welfare environment. Very difficult, but nothing I would regret. And I'm very grateful to the system for raising us, to a certain degree, and feeding us. That was great. And I pay my taxes so that other people can be taken care of now in exactly that same way. But that's what happens, Steve, is they form this narrative in the media, television, radio. You'd get people like Jeremy Vine, and I worked on the Vine show for many years, but he's a typical example of white middle class who's in a certain position, who ask these open questions, but they're all framed to demonize, right? Should we be giving benefits to immigrants? That is an open question for people to pile in on their hatred of immigrants, right? Whereas real journalism should actually attempt to present things in a way that isn't just so because that's set up to be one-sided, those sort of debates that are in the media, and that's what happened. And so that continues throughout, and each case is on a individual basis. The McCann case is different again, why the media are complicit. And I should have brought some water with me, I'm very dry, forgive me. But it's fine. And but the media is very complicit in the McCann case because the media got its fingers burnt with the McCann case. And I don't know if you remember in the beginning, but the media actually behaved like lunatics to a certain degree. And that was certain newspapers, certainly the Express, the Sun, the Mail, all those, they were often repeating what was mere gossip in Portugal and repeating it as fact in British newspapers. So McCann's and their friends had a massive case. The Express ended up putting on the front page an unprecedented apology. And after that moment, that was it. You know, the media never trespassed and never fully questioned the abduction theory ever again. And so, you know, but also it was because, as I was to discover, a lot of my colleagues were actually, they felt sorry for Kate and Joe McCann, because it turned out that my colleagues also left their children, you know, in hotels and apartments when they went on holiday. And that was apparently the thing that a lot of middle-class people do. Well, that is not something that I would ever do. My daughter's 22 now. I was often considered as being overprotective, if anything. And I certainly wouldn't have dreamed of taking her on holiday and leaving her in a hotel room while I went off and got my kicks. That to me is not parenting. That's negligence. That's disgusting. And that's a lot of people have a problem with the fact that Kate and Jerry McCann and their friends have never ever been penalized for that at the start. Yeah. Right. But there's a reason for that. In Portugal, they go on the higher charge. So I think that while there was a certain degree of sympathy towards the McCanns while it was being investigated, when it began to look increasingly like that somebody in that group knew what had taken place, I think there was a feeling that the Portuguese police wanted to go for the higher charge, which was obviously potentially death, murder, you know, as opposed to neglect. So I think that was the issue in Portugal that was going on. But the media and the establishment are complicit. Our media, as it stands, mainstream media, is an establishment media. So, yeah. and that's why we have the problem that we have. They want to maintain the status quo. They don't want people like you and I going, excuse me, this only benefits that percentage of people. We want it to benefit everybody. They don't want that. They want to keep it, you know, all for themselves.
Another case dominating the headlines that I did mention it slightly earlier is of course the scandal surrounding Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, I mean, again, I've been watching a lot of your stuff on your channel and the stuff with Sean Atwood. Can't recommend it highly enough. I find that whole situation fascinating because, of course, the main perpetrator in this crimes is now dead. Ghislaine Maxwell obviously is certainly involved and she's up to her neck in it. The big question is, what is she going to do? She's been arrested, she's been remanded, charged, she's been remanded. A court case is imminent. I think the questions that everybody wants to know is, A, will she survive to see a court case? Well, and B, who's she going to drop in it?
Well, here's the thing, is that everybody, I mean, will she survive? That is the question, you know. I mean, nobody can convince me that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. It's ridiculous. It's too ridiculous, right? Given all the people that they're linked to, we're talking about, you know, prime ministers, presidents, leaders of nations, you know, high-powered barristers, lawyers, I mean, international businessmen, you know, I mean, huge big names that they are linked to, you know, from Bill Gates to Prince Andrew to Bill Clinton to Donald Trump, you name it. It goes on and on and on. Leslie Wexner, it goes on and on and on. They are, you know, Epstein and Maxwell were linked to very, very, very high-powered people and in allegations of child abuse, you know, very, very serious stuff. And excuse me. And so the Prince Andrew thing is, I think, intriguing to many people because that for many people is the first insight that the royal family may have some issues with child abuse. Well, that is far from my first insight into the fact that the royal family may have some issues with child abuse, because we know that Andrew is not the only one to have a paedophile friend. Prince Charles has several. Jimmy Savile was a huge part of the royal family. He could walk in and out of Buckingham Palace. You know, not many people can do that, right? And not many people are called on by the Queen to sit down as a marriage mediator between Charles and Diana, as Jimmy Savile was, right? So all of that is very, very interesting to me. And we know about his story now. We know that he was a procurer of children for members of the establishment, as well as being a paedophile and a necrophiliac himself. So, you know, it's like, to me, Prince Andrew's situation is like the tip of the iceberg. But isn't it interesting how they've gone about it? You know, he really thought that by sitting down with Emily Maitlis, who probably comes from, in some respects, quite a similar background, private school educated, you know, that sort of BBC establishment elite, etc., etc. And he probably thought, I'm going to be able to do this, and then I won't be called into question anymore. But what a pig's ear he made of it. I mean, he couldn't have made it much worse if he tried. Some of the things that he said, you know, that whole thing about how he had an issue with sweating. Do you remember? I mean, just absurd stuff that the man said. Oh, and I couldn't have been there because I was in Pizza Hut in Woking, I think he said. I mean, just how do you remember that? I mean, just, you know, it's like, I mean, none of it makes sense. And also, you know, as his Royal Protection Officer said, you know, there was always somebody with him. It wasn't just a case that he was just buzzing off to, you know, pick up his girls from a party, you know, in a Pizza Hut or whatever. But the Prince Andrew thing, he must be questioned. He must be questioned because the allegations against him are now so serious. We are talking about the rape of an underage girl that is alleged, obviously, Virginia Giuffre, and but there's so much more that needs to be uncovered in terms of that. He must not be allowed to hide. The royal family, as an establishment, has been getting away with it for centuries. We know that. And so what we're now finally getting is some transparency where we're able to see that these people have been mixing around with some of the oddest people for the longest period of time. Now, the question is, now that we've got this information, what are we going to do about it? Because that's what it really comes down to. You know, what are we going to do about it? And I have to run and get some water. You have to forgive me, but I just have to run and get water. Thank you. Yeah, so, you know, we have to hold these people to account. We can't let them fly under the radar, not that they are. The whole Jeffrey Epstein Maxwell story is intriguing to me because I think that we haven't even heard the half of it yet, right? I think that once the real truth starts to come out, I think people are going to be quite shocked because the way that they're trying to portray it, Steve, and this is what I object to, and this is what they did with Clinton. I don't know if you've seen Filthy Rich on Netflix.
Yes.
And okay, well, and to all intents and purposes, that appears to be a very, very well put together documentary series, but it tells but a fraction of the story. What it sort of creates is this idea that these young girls were a bit sort of fast and loose and were prepared to pick up money. And it sets a certain narrative, and it creates for some people, not for me certainly, right? Not for me ever, but it creates for some people more of a sympathy, like degrees of rape. So it's almost like, okay, well, some of them were like 16 years old. So that's not as bad as if they were doing it to children of 10 or 12, right? So we're not hearing any of the dark stuff that are also the allegations. We're getting one particular narrative. And this is what happened with Bill Clinton about the Monica Lewinsky situation. Is Bill has always been portrayed as a ladies' man, right? That's always been the deal about Bill Clinton. Well, that is far preferable for him than perhaps being portrayed as a paedophile, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So it's sometimes they choose the lesser option. Like, okay, I'd rather be known as somebody who has affairs on my wife than somebody who actually is a child abuser. And I think that's what's taking place to a certain degree. Yeah. So we have to be careful. Yeah, it is. They're constantly playing tricks with us, Steve, to dumb down not dumb down, to sort of lessen the crimes of these people, because these people are supported by the establishment. Don't forget, you know, Epstein and Maxwell were involved with the Israeli intelligence, right? Well, we know that intelligences around the world routinely have used child abuse to be able to blackmail other people, have videos of child abuse, and then they can force people into agreeing to certain laws, certain, cross-border cooperation, which is what they often want. And they use children. Children are their currency. This is a known fact. This has been going on for a long time in the intelligence services. And Epstein had cameras all over his, apartments and places. He was filming people.
Yeah,
that would have been for blackmail purposes.
Certainly was. I mean, there's a lot of rumours. Of course, I visited the Cray twins in prison. I visited Reggie Cray for 10 years, Ronnie Cray for 5 years. And it was something that, they were alleged to have done in the past as well. That they were involved certainly in trafficking young men, young boys to the, politicians of the day. And I'm not saying that those boys were underage, but they were certainly involved in, the sex industry, and the likes of, Tom Dryburgh and Lord Boothby were certainly, involved up to the neck in that.
Right.
It was all exposed in the Daily Mirror. So it's, it's something which has gone on for years. It doesn't surprise me. And when you see it in the modern day, it doesn't surprise me either. But obviously I want to move on to what you've been working on recently. And I put in a request for an interview a while back to you.
You did.
After seeing your work, and you were working on this COVID project, which again is very topical. I know that we've spoken a little bit about it with Sean, but just tell us what it's about, when we can expect to see it, and what your findings have been.
Well, I mean, basically, where do I start on this? Well, I'll start at the beginning, and I'll make it as concise as I possibly can. At the beginning of this year, I had surgery. Actually, in October last year, I was admitted to hospital, Kingston in southwest London. That then followed that I had surgery in January of this year. And shortly after surgery, I was taken very ill, and it appeared that I had contracted COVID-19. And I was lying in bed one Saturday morning in March with this COVID. And I just thought, I need to be documenting this, because even though I was lying in bed sick, I'm still a journalist, Steve. I can't always switch off. I'm sure you can relate to this.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of picked up my iPad and I started thrashing out this script of all the stuff that I'd already picked up that I was having problems with, because one of my jobs is I'm a paper reviewer for TV and radio. And so I was reviewing newspaper, and it doesn't stop me being critical of mainstream media, incidentally. And obviously sometimes it gets me bugged off because producers get pissed off with me bad mouthing, but that's just the way it goes. That's the swings and roundabouts of my work. But I was reviewing papers throughout this for BBC 5 Live, the Stephen Nolan show. And so I'd started in like February, when all the first hype was really starting about COVID. We'd had little whispers of it, but this was where the media was starting to up the ante, and it was like every other story, and it was starting to get more and more intense. And I was like, whoa, this is all a bit too much. And it had all the hallmarks of propaganda to me. And so I was doing these newspaper reviews, and all our stories were all the reviews were already COVID by February, right? And so this is in the documentary. So to cut a very long story short, I decided to make it into a documentary because I could see that this story was not going to be told. I wanted to separate fact from fiction. There was information coming from, there was, you see, I'm a very natural person. I just do whatever needs to take place, whether there's a camera on me or not. If I need to just pick something up my nose, I just do it because it's the way it goes. And anyway, so basically I started to do this COVID report. And there was so much information coming in from mainstream, but not just mainstream, from online, alternative media. And I was like, all of this is terrorizing people. I need to find out what the truth is, because I was starting to feel a sense of terror because I was also unwell as well on top of everything else. Incidentally, it turned out that the hospital, the reason why I mentioned the hospitals and why it's important is because the first hospital I was admitted to, that was where the first registered COVID death in the UK was. And the second hospital I had my surgery, that was the next 3 registered COVID UK deaths. So what are the chances that the 2 hospitals that I'm in were the first registered COVID deaths? So that to me was curious as well. I come from a very spiritual background, so I don't ignore connections like that. That's like a synergy going on to me. So I did this script, started out, it was just like a 12-page script. By the time we finished, it was 68 pages, absolutely insane. because it's a big story. It's a massive story. It's like, we have literally been terrorized. There's so much that was wrong with it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a believer that that the virus itself was a hoax. I believe it absolutely to be in existence. In fact, I believe that one of the biggest scandals about this, Steve, and we go into some detail in the report, is what happened in elderly care homes, which makes me furious. Absolutely furious. They carried out herd immunity in those care homes with those elderly people. There is a demographic to COVID, right? Not all of us are going to be impacted by it. And I ended up with these long-term effects. I was tested twice, both tested negative, even though doctors I was seeing kept saying to me, you've got COVID, because they're so keen with those symptoms to stamp you with it as well. So that was very interesting to me, the sort of inflation of the figures as well. But what happened in elderly care homes was an absolute scandal. The government realised that the government have basically been breaking down the NHS for the last 10 plus years, started with Tony Blair, selling off parts of the NHS. Tony Blair, let's not forget, was really Margaret Thatcher's son. He may have been Labour, but he was Margaret Thatcher through and through. I mean, I think the old saying is, Margaret Thatcher's greatest achievement was Tony Blair, right? So we know kind of, and I voted for him because I come from a Labour background. I voted for him because I believed all that. And I believed certain things like working tax credit, which Gordon Brown introduced. I thought they were all excellent, good things to redistribute well. So I had support for those sort of things. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But they've been breaking down the NHS for the last 10 plus years, selling it off, privatising it, bringing in big outsourcing companies like Serco, for example, all of these, big outsourcers. And they've decimated it, actually. And they've lost, I think it's like 250,000 nurses. It's just insane, the amount that they've lost. 22,000 beds that went over to be privatised, right? This is a lot. And that's why they had to then create those makeshift hospitals, the Nightingale hospitals. And the reason that they closed down the country is they decimated the NHS so much that they were worried it was going to be overwhelmed. That's the story. That's the truth of what happened. Yeah. And why are we in a position, as somebody said to me the other week, that the NHS is supposed to protect us? We're not supposed to protect the NHS. We've all been set up to protect the NHS. It's, it is hugely, massively funded. There is no reason why it shouldn't be functioning okay. And it's because, something that, pads that supplied by pads when they're outsourced, for example, they ratchet up the profit. So it's much more expensive to buy all these supplies and things into the NHS. These are friends of MPs, all linked to the Health and Social Care Bill that was also going through around about the same time as the Welfare Reform Bill. Health and Social Care Bill was about the privatisation of the NHS. I wrote about that quite extensively. And what was worrying about that, Steve, was that 319, I think that's the correct figure, it's certainly over 319 MPs and Lords were allowed to vote on the on the Health and Social Care Bill, which impacted our health services, and they had shares in private healthcare companies, as well as having interests. You'd never be able to get away with that at local council level, but you can get away with that at national government level. Shocking. Really? So that's what they've done. They've torn apart our NHS. They've gotten rid of nurses. They've brought in bank nurses who cost double than NHS. They're not investing in decent training. It's all about privatisation. We were put in this situation with a virus that they potentially didn't know much about, although they had done a round table about and knew that they didn't have the PPE and the supplies that they needed. Bill Gates had done, had been involved in round tables that looked at pandemics, and some people said that was a sort of, a foreshadow of what was going to take place. But so the COVID report for us was about separating fact from fiction, but also being there for people to be able to look back on, so that we could not be so easily walked into that situation again. We were walked into lockdown. I was like saying, it's done in a chronological order. So you have like 10 days before lockdown, 5 days before lockdown, 2 days before lockdown, 127 days after lockdown, right? It's done like so that it's like a real time for people as they're people will be able to say, I remember that first moment when I went to the shops and everybody had bought the loo rolls in panic, for example. So I wanted it to be like that. So anyway, so we've been working on it, a very small independent unit. It's a lot of work, a massive project. We sat down 2.5 weeks ago, watched it, over 2 hours long, because it's huge. Couldn't decide whether to make it into 2 parts. But I also got a friend of mine to legal it and tell me what, were the legal issues, which look, a lot of the help I get is people just supporting my work and being prepared to do stuff to just support that. So a lawyer saying, I don't want paid for it, I'll go over it, and that's my contribution to doing something good. And that's great, that's fantastic. But then we got in some information after that meant we had to rewrite quarter of it, because it changed quarter of the story. So it meant that quarter of the production still had to be done after that. Anyway, it's now gone off to a friend of mine who works in cinema for her to basically check it for me. And as soon as it's back, and as soon as we've finished that final level of production, it will be available free and online. I can't give a date for that, unfortunately. You know how it works, Steve. It's like, it's really difficult to do that. But the aim, it will be on my channel on YouTube. It might not stay on my channel on YouTube because it questions the official narrative. All of it.
That's the hard part, isn't it? I mean, with YouTube, it's great, but you start to put anything that goes against the grain or against the system, if you like, then you find that it either gets a strike or it gets taken down. And I think that's why a lot of people, especially Sean and yourself, have moved over to brand YouTube, which seems to be
absolutely
fantastic platform on there, where you can get something completely unedited and get the truth out there.
Absolutely. So the likelihood is that it will certainly be on there as well, and it might only be on there, and we'll find other places as well, because it's really important to me with these reports to not be subject to the whims of mainstream, right? So, I mean, we do have other projects that are ongoing that we are working with mainstream to get them out. But this one, I didn't trust going through the filter of mainstream to go to producers that I know, because I know what they'd have to do, and it's not their fault. There's good people who work in mainstream media, but they're subject to all these different whims and different things as well. And the official narrative in the mainstream is the official narrative, right? So they say that this amount of people have died and there was this problem with PPE and this money, but that isn't actually necessarily the case. But they do stick rigidly to sometimes it's like they're just burping out government press releases, I mean, I don't need to tell you that. And so I couldn't go through their filter, and that's why it's really important to just get it online, free to air, so people can see it without going through the filters of mainstream, because it's a story that has to be told.
It's fantastic. It's great that you've tackled that. And
thank you.
Me personally, I'm really looking forward to seeing
Thank you.
Because, I think, look, we can all have opinions. We've all got different opinions about different things. And, broaden your horizons is what I say. Listen to all sides of the argument and then make your decision. Don't just listen to the narrative that's pumped out by the media. And I think that's the best way to live your life. But unfortunately, not everyone does that. We're coming towards the end. There's a couple of other things I do want to ask you about, because they're big news stories which have run and run. First one really is Michael Barrymore. And I mean, for me, again, it's another one which by the media every now and then. Usually when he's making a comeback, whether he's walking into the Big Brother house or whether he's going to go on to I'm a Celebrity, or he's doing Celebrity Come Dancing, whatever he's doing, dancing on ice, you name it. He's tried every comeback. He's probably had more comebacks than Frank Sinatra. But, from my perspective, watching Michael Barrymore, he looks like a tortured soul. He looks like he's carrying a huge secret for me. And, the person I really feel sorry for is the victim's dad, who still an answer all these years later as to what happened to his son at the swimming pool at that party.
I couldn't agree with you more. Did you see the body in the pool, the Channel 4 documentary? Yeah. That was compelling. That was compelling. There was some compelling evidence on there. And I've since followed that up, because sometimes, obviously, you have to check what's said on mainstream, because you don't know if it's true or not. But it did all flesh out. And Essex Police have obviously got a new investigation into it. They admit there were problems in the original investigation. But I completely agree with you. I think that Barrymore has probably always been a tortured soul, in all honesty. But the people here who really, really matter are the loved ones who have been left behind. And obviously justice for Stuart Lubbock himself. a young man who met Barrymore and his entourage in a Essex nightclub and went back to Barrymore's house where they sort of had an after party. I think there was 9 of them in total. And Stuart, you know, by 5 o'clock in the morning, I think that's when the police came, Stuart was dead. And clearly he'd been brutalized, and they wanted to say that he'd been brutalized at the morgue. And there was every reason to believe, I think, you know, obviously I don't know what happened, I wasn't there, but from the evidence, it would appear that Stuart was sexually, brutally, anally raped. Stuart wasn't gay, wasn't known to be gay. The thing is, I think what happened, and, you know, hearing the people around, I think he was just like, this is somebody famous. I want to, you know, it would be great to go to the party, have fun. He just wanted to have fun. And so you're absolutely right. Terry Lubbock, his father, needs justice. Sue, Stuart's ex-wife, needs justice. Stuart's brother needs justice. These people need justice. And the 9 people there have, well, refused to cooperate in appropriate ways. Somebody there knows what happened, right? People don't just end up at parties being as brutally harmed as Stuart did without somebody there not knowing what happened. Simple as that. And obviously Barrymore is the name. And, you know, I'm not saying it was him any more than I'm saying it's anyone particular other person there, but somebody there knows there were problems. It looked like the crime scene was cleared up. Barrymore left the crime scene. These are problems, you know, and it makes people suspicious. So the 20th anniversary next March, Steve, the very least that could happen now is somebody speaks. And it's my experience with these long-term cases that the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? Alliances change, friendships change, people's perspectives change, people grow. So if anybody is watching this who knows what happened, I appeal to you, please give that peace to Stuart Lubbock's loved ones. They need it. They desperately need it, you know. So somebody knows, somebody has that information, and it's more than time for them to speak up about it now.
Wow, yeah, definitely agree. We started with, you know, media and stuff at the start of the interview in part 1. So part 2 is going to finish with that. And I'm not sure whether you saw this. We haven't prepped this, so you might not have seen it, might need to catch up. But the Murdoch dynasties was something I watched during lockdown. And
what?
The Murdoch dynasties.
Oh, yes, I've heard about it.
If you haven't seen it, it was. I
haven't seen it.
Into Rupert Murdoch. And I just really wanted to know what your opinion was on Rupert Murdoch, and you know, essentially the life that he's led, but also on you know, the media that he developed. I found it a fascinating story. Again, I went into it with open eyes. I've got my own opinions on Murdoch. I do feel that things like Operation U-Tree, for example, were simply Rupert Murdoch opening his little black book once the news of the world had shut down and said, "You with my newspaper, I'm going to finish your career."
Wow.
That was my opinion.
Well, that was all the 70s entertainers, right?
Yeah, but I just thought it was a suspicious move, Sonia. Once the news of the world had to be closed because of the phone hacking, and then because of the forthcoming investigation, only we suddenly start to see the world collapse around some very big name celebrities, and it was almost as if, you know, the old fake Sheikh's black book was laid back, and everyone who had a skeleton in that closet, suddenly it was front page news. And I don't know what making Murdoch and just the whole ethos around him and what he worked for, what he strived for, and what he's continuing to be involved in, you know.
Right. Well, I mean, as a journalist, I've obviously worked across various Murdoch platforms, be that News International or Sky News. But I mean, people always say that Sky is Murdoch's, but he only has a percentage of it. I know he wanted that takeover, and that hasn't happened. But he has far too much influence. Of course, we know that. And the thing is because this is a man who has determined the outcome of elections, right? And, you know, and so that's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. We know that you know, some of his publications are incredibly divisive. But having said that, if you want to cherry pick, like, for example, the Sunday Times has been one of the few that has been prepared to look into the indoctrination of children to do with the gender issue, for example. So there's like good and bad in everything, and you have to kind of sort of cherry pick it and everything. But Murdoch as a character, of course, way too powerful. His relationship, his ongoing relationship, remember, with all the Leveson inquiry, that was all about looking at the relationship between politicians and media. And it was completely exposed that David Cameron and Rebecca Brooks, who was obviously Rupert Murdoch's, right-hand woman, he loved Rebecca, probably still does. But David Cameron, who was then our British Prime Minister, was like, what, loaning or borrowing her horse. Or they would bet a horse going backwards and forwards. They do loan, which David Cameron always thought lol was lots of love when he signed off to Rebecca Brooks as one example. And Rebecca Brooks was highly behind Operation Grange, incidentally, right? And she used that as a type of blackmail to get that investigation started, right? So we're talking about people with way too much power in our political circle. We need a complete severance between politicians and media. There is no other way that you can get decent or just media unless you have that. So we know that Rupert Murdoch is still meeting with Boris Johnson and Number 10. It's not okay, not acceptable at all. Far too much power, far too much influence. No.
It's an amazing documentary series. It was 3 parts.
I'll watch it.
Focusing in particular on who will take over the crown, the throne, if you like, who will take the crown off Murdoch, and it's just a fascinating battle. And I think you really appreciate it because it shows the connections, it shows the Cameron connection, it shows how he was, basically involved in, crowning the last 3 prime ministers in our time. But also how, he's, taking on Fox News and creating Fox News across in America. He's now played a big part in the presidential race and helped get Trump into the position that he's in. And of course, that wasn't without scandal because, of course, there was, a sexual deviant amongst their midst at Fox News as well, which, essentially saw that, company collapse as well. But Sonia, listen, I could genuinely sit on here and speak to you all day, but I know...
Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant. Look, Steve, the most important thing is we need as independent a media as humanly possible. The media's job should be to highlight injustices and corruptions and tell the truth. I consider my position a very, very responsible one. I never hide my allegiances, who I'm involved with, who might be employing me. I'll use any platform that I can to get the important messages out, as long as it's on my terms. But thank you very, very much. I always, it's good to have a good chat, really. And I know that you're one of the good guys, Steve. So, happy to support what you're doing. And thank you very much.
And sorry about the technical errors earlier. Look, we tried to go with it so you could all have a chat and ask questions. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Sonia and I will chat again. But best of luck with Sean's stuff. And
thank you so much.
Fantastic. And if anybody wants to see Sonia's channel, please subscribe. The link's down below. But Sonia Poulton,
thank you
for joining us.
Thank you. Have a brilliant week. Take care, Steve.